Some people show gratitude when you give them a gift, but others act as if generosity is something they are entitled to, as if your effort, your money, and your thoughtfulness are just resources to be redistributed however they see fit. I had always known that my family operated that way, had always understood that when it came to my parents, there was a clear divide between what they expected from me and what they expected from my brother, Daniel. He had been the golden child from the moment he was born, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose mistakes were forgiven before they were even acknowledged, the one who was given everything while I was expected to fend for myself. But despite knowing that, despite a lifetime of being second place in their eyes, I had still thought, foolishly, that this time would be different. I had spent months planning the perfect gift, months researching cruise lines, reading reviews, comparing itineraries, and making sure every little detail was perfect. It wasn't just any vacation. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, an all-expenses-paid luxury cruise through some of the most beautiful destinations in the world, with 5-star accommodations, private excursions, and unlimited fine dining. I had imagined their excitement when I told them, had pictured the joy on their faces, had allowed myself to believe, even if only for a moment, that they would see this for what it was, a gesture of love, of appreciation, of gratitude for everything they had done for me growing up. But that moment never came, because before I had even finished explaining the details, before they had even fully processed what I was saying, my mother was already shaking her head, already dismissing the idea, already making it clear that my effort had been wasted. "Oh, sweetheart, that's so generous of you," she said, her voice carrying that warm, patronizing tone she always used when she was about to say something I wouldn't like. "But, I think it would mean so much more if Daniel and Olivia took this trip instead. They've been so stressed lately, and they really need a break." I sat there, my mouth slightly open, my heart sinking as I processed what I had just heard, as I realized that they weren't even considering accepting the gift for themselves. It wasn't a discussion, wasn't a question, wasn't something they thought they needed to consult me about. It was a decision, made instantly, effortlessly, as if it had been obvious from the start that anything I gave them should automatically be rerouted to my brother, as if he was the one who truly deserved it. My father, ever the passive observer, simply nodded along, not even bothering to look at me as he added, "Yeah, it's really kind of you, but Daniel and Olivia would get so much more out of it than we would. You know how hard things have been for
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
them." Hard for them? Daniel, the same brother who had never worked a full-time job in his life, who jumped from one failed business idea to another while expecting my parents to foot the bill. Olivia, his wife, who spent more time at spas and brunches than actually contributing to their household. They were struggling? They needed a break more than my parents, the ones who had spent their whole lives working, raising us, making sacrifices? More than me, the person who had actually paid for the damn thing? I forced a smile, pushing down the resentment that threatened to rise, swallowing the bitter words that sat on the tip of my tongue, reminding myself that nothing I said would change their minds. "Of course," I said, nodding as if I agreed, as if this was perfectly fine, as if I hadn't just been slapped in the face by their complete disregard for my effort. "That makes sense. I'm sure they'll love it." And that was it. No gratitude, no appreciation, no acknowledgement of what I had done. Just a simple decision that my generosity was better suited for someone else, someone more deserving in their eyes, someone who had spent his entire life taking without ever giving anything in return. Later that evening, I got a text from Daniel, a simple, casual message that only added fuel to the fire already burning inside me. "Hey, Mom said you got us a cruise? That's awesome. Really appreciate it. Olivia's already planning outfits, lol. No thank you. No recognition of the fact that it had never been for him in the first place. Just an assumption that, once again, something had fallen into his lap, that he had been handed another free luxury experience, without lifting a finger. I could picture him grinning at his phone, could hear the smugness in his voice, could already imagine the conversations he and Olivia were having about how much fun they were going to have, about how lucky they were, about how generous I had been. But the thing was, I wasn't generous. Not anymore. Because while Daniel and Olivia were busy dreaming about their first-class suite, their private balcony, their extravagant meals, and exclusive excursions, I was already making a plan. I wasn't going to argue, wasn't going to fight, wasn't going to waste my breath trying to explain why what they had done was wrong. Instead, I was going to do something much, much better. So I smiled, I said nothing, and I waited. Because Daniel might have thought he was getting the trip of a lifetime. But what he didn't know was that I had just made one small change. Daniel and Olivia reacted exactly as I knew they would, with the kind of giddy, over-the-top enthusiasm that came naturally to people who had never known what it meant to actually earn something. The moment my mother told them that their luxury cruise had been taken care of, that they were being gifted a once-in-a-lifetime, all-expenses-paid trip, they didn't hesitate for even a second to ask where it had come from, didn't bother wondering if maybe, just maybe, they should acknowledge the person responsible for it. No, they just grinned, high-fived each other like a couple of teenagers who had just won backstage passes to a concert, and immediately launched into an excited conversation about everything they deserved to experience. "This is amazing," Olivia had gushed, clutching Daniel's arm as if he had been the one to provide this incredible opportunity instead of just being handed something that had never belonged to him in the first place. "We so need this trip, babe. I mean, after everything we've been through, we earned this." Earned? The word nearly made me laugh out loud, nearly made me choke on my own anger, nearly made me break the carefully neutral expression I had plastered onto my face. They had earned nothing. They had done nothing. They had simply existed, had simply relied on the same entitlement that had carried them through their entire lives, had simply assumed that whatever good fortune came their way was something the universe owed them. Daniel, of course, had no shame, no hesitation, no second thoughts as he pulled out his phone, immediately texting friends and making plans, already treating this trip as if it had been designed specifically for him, as if this had been the plan all along. "Man, this is perfect timing," he said, barely looking up as he typed, grinning to himself as if the universe had once again aligned in his favor. "We've been talking about taking a trip for months, but you know how things have been, work's been a nightmare, and we just haven't had the time to really plan something, so this is actually perfect." Work? What work? The man hadn't held a stable job in years, had spent the last decade bouncing between failed businesses, half-baked side hustles, and whatever short-lived investments he could convince my parents to fund. He had no concept of stress, no idea what it was like to actually work for something, no understanding of how infuriating it was to watch someone be rewarded for absolutely nothing. And Olivia? She was no better. She was already deep into her own little fantasy, scrolling through luxury travel pages on her phone, looking at outfit inspirations, thinking about all the Instagram photos she would take, all the perfect little moments she would document, all the ways she could show off a vacation that she had neither planned nor paid for. "Oh my God, babe," she gasped, holding up her phone so Daniel could see. "They have a champagne sail-away party. Can you imagine? Us, standing on the deck, watching the sunset, holding glasses of champagne like real high-class travelers? This is everything." The rage simmered low in my stomach, a slow burn, controlled and steady, but oh, so present. It wasn't the bragging that got to me, wasn't even the entitlement. I had long since accepted that Daniel and Olivia had been conditioned to believe that their comfort was a priority to everyone around them. No, it was the way I didn't exist in this equation, the way they never once acknowledged that I had been the one to orchestrate this, the way my name had never even entered the conversation. There was no thank you, no moment of realization, no awkward recognition that maybe this had come at the expense of someone else's generosity. They spoke as if the universe itself had decided they deserved a luxury vacation, as if the trip had simply materialized out of nowhere, as if there was never a possibility that it had been meant for someone else. My parents, of course, saw nothing wrong with any of it. "You should really be happy for them," my mother said later, her voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment, the one that suggested I was the problem for not fully embracing the way things had played out. "I mean, you work so much, sweetheart, and they really needed this. You wouldn't want to see them struggling while you sit here, doing just fine, would you?" Struggling? What a joke. Daniel and Olivia had never struggled a day in their lives, had never gone without, had never once had to truly deal with the consequences of their actions. Struggle meant working for something and not getting it. Struggle meant earning something and still falling short. Struggle did not mean getting handed a free vacation at someone else's expense and pretending like it was a necessary act of charity. So I smiled like I always did, like they expected me to, like I had been trained to do since childhood. "Of course, Mom," I said smoothly, nodding as if I agreed, as if I wasn't seething with quiet, controlled fury. "I'm really happy for them. They deserve it." And just like that, my mother's face softened, as if she truly believed that my agreement had been genuine, as if she thought she had finally gotten through to me, as if she had successfully erased whatever petty feelings I had been holding on to. She had no idea.
None of them did.
Because while Daniel and Olivia were busy fantasizing about their VIP experience, about their champagne sail away, about their gourmet meals and private balcony views, I was already making the next move. "Oh, by the way," I said casually, turning toward Daniel as if the thought had just occurred to me, as if it was nothing more than an afterthought, as if it wasn't the most critical piece of my plan. "I'll need your passport details so I can finalize everything. You know, make sure the tickets are perfectly set up for you." Daniel barely looked up from his phone, waving a dismissive hand as he rattled off his information, trusting, thoughtless, completely unaware that he had just handed me exactly what I needed. And so I smiled. I nodded. I said nothing, because Daniel might have thought he was about to board the luxury vacation of his dreams. But what he didn't know was that I had just made one small change. The moment Daniel handed over his passport details without so much as a second thought, without even pausing to acknowledge that I was the one facilitating the entire trip, I knew with absolute certainty that what I was about to do was entirely justified. He hadn't hesitated, hadn't questioned, hadn't once wondered if maybe, just maybe, he should acknowledge the fact that this vacation had originally been intended for someone else. He had simply assumed, as he always did, that everything would work out in his favor, that the world would continue bending to accommodate him, that life would always ensure he got the best of everything while everyone else was left to pick up the scraps. I waited until I was alone in my apartment, sitting comfortably on my couch with my laptop open, a fresh cup of coffee on the table beside me, and a slow, satisfied smirk playing at my lips as I pulled up the cruise reservation system. The confirmation email was already sitting in my inbox, pristine and untouched, filled with details about his upcoming luxury vacation, the one he had never even earned, the one that had been effortlessly handed to him because my parents had decided, yet again, that his happiness was more important than mine. The subject line read, "Your luxury suite awaits." And something about those words made me laugh softly, shaking my head at the sheer irony of it all. Not anymore. I clicked into the system, navigating through the various booking options, scanning through the selections, carefully reading every fine print clause and every modification possibility, ensuring that I knew exactly what I was about to do before making a single move. This wasn't something I was going to rush, wasn't something I would do haphazardly. I wanted to make sure that when Daniel and Olivia arrived at the dock, brimming with excitement, ready to board their first-class suite, expecting nothing less than the absolute best, they would be met with something they never saw coming. The first thing I changed was the cabin type, swapping out the spacious, ocean view suite with a balcony for a small, windowless economy cabin at the very bottom of the ship, the kind of cramped, claustrophobic room that people only booked when they were desperate to save money. No natural light, no picturesque view of the waves, no luxury king-sized bed with plush linens, just a stiff mattress in a space barely big enough for two people to stand comfortably. I made sure to select the absolute worst possible placement, ensuring that their cabin was located near the engine room, where the constant hum of machinery would vibrate through the walls at all hours of the night, an unrelenting, low-pitched drone that would make restful sleep nearly impossible. Next, I adjusted their dining plan, stripping them of their access to the premium restaurants, the gourmet dining experiences, the high-end meals that had been included in the original package. No five-star dining, no private chef-prepared courses, no exclusive wine pairings. Instead, I reassigned them to buffet-only service, meaning that every meal they had on board would be mass-produced, lukewarm, and served in a noisy, overcrowded hall filled with families scrambling to fill their plates before the trays were emptied. No candlelit dinners, no personalized service, no luxury, just mediocre food on plastic trays, surrounded by crying children and stressed-out parents. Then came the final, most beautiful touch, the VIP perks, or rather, the lack thereof. I removed everything that would have made their experience anything close to luxurious. No priority boarding, no exclusive lounge access, no complimentary spa treatments, no reserved seating for shows, no private pools, no access to premium bars. Instead, I ensured that every aspect of their trip would be filled with the kind of mild inconveniences that would slowly chip away at their excitement, at their patience, at their entitlement. They would wait in long lines for everything: boarding, dining, activities, entertainment. They would be stuck in crowded areas, forced to deal with every minor annoyance that the standard guests had to endure, realizing too late that they were not, in fact, special. Just when I thought I was done, I spotted one last option, something I hadn't initially planned for but couldn't resist. A small checkbox under celebration package preferences that read, "Would you like a special announcement made for your guests during the cruise?" Without hesitation, I checked the box and filled in the request field with careful precision, ensuring that at some point during their first night at dinner, over the ship's speaker system, the staff would make a delightful little announcement congratulating Daniel and Olivia on winning a complimentary economy stay aboard the cruise ship, generously provided as part of a discounted guest package. I could already picture the look on Olivia's face when she realized that, instead of being viewed as luxury guests, they would be seen as lucky contest winners, people who had barely scraped their way onto the ship. With one final deep breath, I clicked save, watching as the system processed the changes, updating the reservation, ensuring that everything was locked in place, non-refundable, non-upgradable, completely irreversible. I leaned back into my couch, exhaling slowly, feeling the tension that had been building inside me for days finally begin to dissolve. This wasn't just about the cruise, wasn't just about Daniel getting what he deserved. This was about finally breaking the cycle, about refusing to let myself be pushed aside, about proving that I wasn't going to be the silent, accommodating afterthought they had always expected me to be. Daniel and Olivia had no idea. They had no clue that while they were busy packing their designer luggage, planning outfits, and gloating about their upcoming trip, I was sitting here, sipping my coffee, calmly ensuring that their dream vacation would become a slow-burning, infuriating disappointment. And the best part? By the time they realized what had happened, by the time they understood just how wrong their assumptions had been, by the time they were standing at the dock with their bags in hand, confused and furious, there would be absolutely nothing they could do to fix it. So I smiled, knowing they had no idea. The morning of departure arrived with a crisp breeze rolling in from the ocean, the kind of perfect weather that made for a picturesque sail away, the kind of day where everything felt light and easy, as if the world itself was celebrating new adventures. I could imagine the way Daniel and Olivia were feeling at that exact moment, the way they had woken up early, buzzing with excitement, their expensive luggage packed neatly with carefully curated outfits, their matching designer sunglasses perched on their noses as they drove toward the port. There was no doubt in my mind that they had spent the entire morning talking about what awaited them, about the luxury that had so effortlessly landed in their laps, about the incredible VIP experience they were so sure they were about to have. As I sipped my coffee at home, relaxing into the satisfaction of knowing what was coming, Daniel and Olivia were pulling into the parking lot near the docks, their laughter filling the car, their arrogance seeping into every movement as they stepped out and stretched, soaking in the excitement of what they thought would be an exclusive getaway. Olivia had already taken out her phone, her fingers swiping across the screen as she snapped photos of the massive ship looming before them, its gleaming exterior reflecting the morning sunlight, its sheer size making it clear that this was no ordinary cruise. It was luxury, and Olivia, being exactly the person I knew her to be, was already crafting the perfect caption to go along with her first post of the day. Setting sail in style. First class all the way, baby. Can't wait for 7 days of champagne, sunsets, and serious pampering. Daniel, meanwhile, was barely paying attention to her, too busy marveling at his own good fortune, too preoccupied with the thought that once again, without any real effort on his part, life had handed him something incredible. He slung his arm around Olivia's shoulders, grinning as they strolled toward the check-in area, his confidence so unwavering that it never even occurred to him to check their tickets, to make sure everything was in order, to consider for even a second that something might not be exactly as he expected. The port was busy, filled with travelers dragging suitcases, families excitedly talking over each other, couples holding hands as they prepared to embark on their journey together. But Daniel and Olivia didn't see themselves as regular travelers, didn't consider that they were just two more people in a sea of passengers. No, in their minds, they were special, important, deserving of something better, something exclusive, something far above the rest. So, naturally, they didn't hesitate as they approached the VIP check-in line, the one reserved for first-class suite guests, the one that promised a smooth, seamless experience with zero delays. Olivia adjusted her sunglasses, pushing them higher onto her head as she smirked at the long lines of economy passengers waiting in the standard check-in area, her expression full of the kind of smugness that made her unbearable in moments like this. Daniel, meanwhile, exuded that same unearned confidence, already anticipating the complimentary champagne that would be handed to them once they stepped on board, already imagining the luxury suite waiting for them, already so sure that the universe had, once again, worked in his favor. They reached the check-in counter, Daniel flashing his brightest, most charming smile at the woman behind the desk, placing their tickets down with a casual arrogance that suggested he had done this 100 times before. Olivia leaned against the counter, already scrolling through her phone, too preoccupied with her next post to pay much attention to the logistics of checking in. The woman behind the desk picked up their tickets, her fingers tapping quickly across the keyboard as she pulled up their reservation, her expression neutral, professional, completely unreadable. Daniel and Olivia waited, expecting nothing but smooth sailing, expecting nods of confirmation, expecting the kind of treatment reserved for the wealthiest and most important guests. And then, just as the moment stretched a little too long, just as a hint of confusion flickered across the woman's face, just as her brows furrowed slightly as she glanced back at her screen, Daniel felt the first shift in energy, the first whisper of something being off. The woman looked up, her polite but firm voice cutting through the air like a cold gust of wind. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been a mistake," she said, her tone still pleasant but now carrying a distinct edge of finality. "You're not listed in our first-class guest registry. Please step aside while we sort this out." Daniel blinked, his confident grin faltering for the briefest of moments before he let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if she had just made some kind of silly, inconsequential error. "Oh, that's impossible," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "We're booked in a luxury suite. Maybe check again?" The woman's fingers moved across the keyboard once more, her eyes scanning the screen as she verified the information, and then, after a few seconds, she gave him a small, practiced smile, the kind of smile that customer service workers perfected when they were about to ruin someone's day. "Mr. and Mrs. Calloway, your tickets indicate that you're booked in an economy cabin located on Deck 6, Interior Room C-17, she stated clearly, sliding their printed reservation across the counter for them to see. "I can assure you, this is correct." Olivia, who had been half listening up until that moment, suddenly froze, her fingers tightening around her phone, her breath hitching as her perfectly planned morning crumbled before her eyes. "Wait, what?" she said sharply, snatching the paper off the counter and scanning the text, her eyes darting over the words as if she could will them into saying something different. No, that's not right. We're supposed to be in first class. This has to be a mistake." The check-in agent maintained her professional smile, her voice unwavering, her posture unchanged. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but I assure you, the reservation is exactly as it was booked. If you'd like to step aside, we can double-check with management, but the system is quite clear. Your accommodations are for an economy interior cabin." Daniel's jaw tightened, his entire body stiffening as realization finally began to creep in, as the first real tendrils of panic settled into his chest, as he realized that the situation wasn't changing no matter how many times he blinked. "No, that's wrong," he said, his voice now carrying that dangerous edge of frustration. But before he could finish, another staff member walked over to them, gesturing toward the growing line behind them, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, if you could please step aside. We need to keep the line moving." And just like that, Daniel and Olivia found themselves standing there, stunned, confused, completely derailed by a reality they had never expected. And back at home, sipping my second cup of coffee, I smiled. Because they had no idea just how much worse it was about to get. Daniel and Olivia stood there in stunned silence for a long moment, their brains struggling to process the reality that had just been shoved in their faces, their expectations shattering into pieces as the truth settled in. The line behind them continued moving as other passengers checked in without issue, their excited chatter filling the air, the hum of vacation anticipation washing over everyone except for the two people now staring down at their economy class tickets like they had just been handed a death sentence. The staff at the check-in counter, having already dealt with their fair share of entitled travelers, remained perfectly composed, their expressions neutral, their professionalism unwavering. Daniel, who had spent his entire life getting whatever he wanted through sheer persistence, wasn't ready to accept what was happening. His first instinct was to argue, to push back, to act as if this was nothing more than an administrative error that could be corrected with a few firm words and a refusal to back down. "There's no way this is right," Daniel said, his voice carrying that same confidence that had always worked on our parents, on teachers, on customer service workers who didn't want to deal with the hassle of a prolonged confrontation. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter as if trying to establish dominance through proximity, as if getting closer would somehow make the woman behind the desk more inclined to fix what he refused to believe wasn't a mistake. We were booked in a luxury suite. First class. Private balcony. We're not supposed to be in some tiny, windowless room on a lower deck. The check-in agent gave him a small, polite smile, the kind of customer service smile that hid absolutely no sympathy, the kind of smile that was used to end conversations rather than extend them. "I understand your concern, sir," she said smoothly, her tone unwavering, her patience clearly endless. "But as I mentioned before, the reservation in our system shows that your accommodations are for an interior economy cabin on Deck 6. The tickets you were sent also reflect this information. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to make last-minute upgrades at the check-in counter. If you'd like to discuss this further, you're welcome to speak with guest services once you're on board, but I do want to note that we are fully booked for this voyage, and there likely won't be any available upgrades." Olivia let out a strangled laugh, the sound high-pitched and desperate, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Daniel's arm as if she needed to physically ground herself to avoid losing her mind right then and there. "Daniel," she hissed, her voice just low enough that only he could hear, her panic barely contained, her desperation creeping in at the edges. "Do something. Fix this." Daniel straightened, puffing out his chest, his hands now clenched into fists as he turned his frustration toward the only person in front of him who had the misfortune of being within reach. "This is insane," he snapped, his voice rising, his entitled outrage bubbling over. "You need to check again. You need to fix this. I don't care what your system says. We're supposed to be in a suite." The check-in agent didn't even flinch, didn't waver, didn't offer an ounce of sympathy. She simply tapped her keyboard a few times, pretending to search for something, then shook her head with that same polite, unchanging smile. "I'm sorry, sir. There are no further changes that can be made at this time. If you'd like to proceed with your check-in, we can escort you to your designated boarding area." Daniel clenched his jaw so tightly that the muscle twitched, his entire body vibrating with barely contained fury. Olivia, meanwhile, had finally broken out of her stunned silence, her face twisted in disgust, her anger slipping into full-blown meltdown mode. "You don't understand," she snapped, her voice taking on that shrill, high-maintenance tone that only came out when she didn't get what she wanted. "We aren't economy passengers. We don't stay in tiny rooms. This is supposed to be a luxury experience, and we paid good money for And that was when the check-in agent actually broke character, the first hint of something resembling amusement flickering behind her otherwise unreadable eyes. "Ma'am," she said, her voice still pleasant but now carrying an unmistakable edge, a subtle, unspoken warning that they were pushing it. "You may want to double-check your payment records before making a claim like that." Daniel's nostrils flared. Olivia's face went red. Neither of them had a response. Because deep down, beneath all the entitlement and the denial, they knew. They knew they hadn't paid for anything. They knew this trip had been a gift, had been something they had been given, had been a luxury that had fallen into their laps without effort. They knew they had no real leverage here, no real authority, no actual right to demand better treatment. And so, with no other choice, with no backup plan, with no path to getting what they wanted, they were forced to accept it. Their bags were tagged and sent below deck, disappearing down the conveyor belt toward their not-so-luxurious accommodations. Their check-in process was finalized, their economy wristbands handed over, a glaring contrast to the sleek, gold VIP wristbands worn by the first-class passengers they had assumed they would be among. And as they walked toward the boarding area, their steps heavy, their moods soured, their excitement completely obliterated, Olivia pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with rapid, frustrated energy. She was calling my mother. And, predictably, not even 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with an incoming call, my mother's name flashing across the screen, a call that I knew was about to be filled with panic, disappointment, and a desperate demand to fix something that was entirely out of my hands. I let it ring twice, taking a deep breath, schooling my expression into something carefully innocent, preparing myself for what was about to come. Then, with all the warmth and sweetness I could muster, I answered. "Oh no," I said, my voice laced with perfectly practiced concern. What happened? The morning had started just the way I had planned it, with my phone buzzing repeatedly, vibrating against the wooden surface of my kitchen table as messages and calls poured in from my mother, each one more frantic than the last. I didn't pick up, didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the chaos unfolding on the other end of the line, because I already knew exactly what was happening, already knew that Daniel was losing his mind at the dock, already knew that Olivia was probably on the verge of tears, already knew that my parents were scrambling to fix something that could not, under any circumstances, be undone. So instead of letting their panic disrupt my peaceful morning, I took my time, made myself a fresh cup of coffee, settled into the warmth of my cozy apartment, and let the inevitable play out exactly as it was meant to. Meanwhile, at the port, Daniel's patience had reached its breaking point, his initial disbelief morphing into outright fury as he stood in the middle of the VIP check-in area, his face flushed with anger, his voice rising with every passing second. Olivia had been the first to crack, her earlier confidence replaced by mortification, her perfect morning unraveling into a nightmare as she stared down at the printed confirmation in her hands, the undeniable proof that they had, in fact, been booked into an economy cabin. No suite, no private balcony, no ocean views, just a cramped, windowless room tucked away in the lower decks of the ship, the exact opposite of the glamorous getaway they had been expecting. "This is a mistake," Daniel snapped, slamming his palm down onto the check-in counter, his jaw tight, his posture rigid, his frustration spilling over in waves of barely contained rage. "We're supposed to be in first class. My parents bought us a luxury suite, so someone here obviously screwed up." The staff member behind the counter remained professional, unfazed by his outburst, her expression calm and unreadable as she double-checked the reservation details on the screen in front of her. "I completely understand your frustration, sir," she said, her voice measured, polite, but carrying the unmistakable finality of someone who had dealt with far worse complaints before. "However, I can assure you that there is no mistake. The reservation is exactly as it was processed in our system, and your assigned cabin is confirmed." Olivia let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head as she placed a manicured hand on her hip, her fingers curling around the edge of her designer purse, as if holding onto it would somehow keep her grounded in reality. "This is ridiculous," she spat, turning to Daniel with wide, desperate eyes, her carefully applied makeup doing nothing to hide the absolute horror on her face. "Babe, do something. We can't stay in some budget room for a whole week. This is supposed to be a luxury experience." Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers clenching into fists at his sides as he turned back to the check-in agent, his anger barely restrained. "Get me a manager," he demanded, his voice low but dangerous, his entitlement radiating off him in waves. "Because I'm not getting on that ship until this is fixed." The woman remained unshaken, her professionalism unwavering as she gave him a small, practiced smile, the kind that customer service workers reserved for guests who thought they had power but, in reality, had none. "I can certainly call my supervisor, sir," she replied, pressing a button on the small intercom beside her. "But I should inform you that all ticket modifications are final. Your reservation is non-refundable and non-upgradable, and all rooms have already been assigned for the sailing." Olivia let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palm as she processed what had just been said. "You mean we can't change it?" she asked, her voice laced with sheer disbelief, as if the idea of being told no had never once occurred to her. "We're stuck in that tiny, disgusting room?" The woman nodded, her voice even, her response leaving zero room for negotiation. "That is correct, ma'am." Daniel took a sharp step back, running both hands over his face before turning toward Olivia, his nostrils flaring, his breathing heavy, his rage bubbling beneath the surface, barely contained. "This has to be a joke," he muttered, shaking his head furiously, his mind scrambling for a way out, for a solution, for someone to blame. And then, as if the realization had just struck him like a bolt of lightning, his expression darkened, his fists clenching at his sides as he reached for his phone. "My sister did this." Without hesitation, he dialed my parents, his fingers moving furiously across the screen, his free hand gripping his suitcase handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The phone barely rang twice before my mother picked up, her voice already frantic, already carrying the weight of whatever message Daniel had just sent before calling. "Daniel, sweetheart, what's going on?" she asked, her tone filled with concern, as if she had sensed from the very start that this wasn't going to be the easy, perfect vacation they had promised him. "She screwed us," Daniel hissed, his voice shaking with anger as he turned away from the check-in counter, lowering his tones so no one else could hear. "She changed the tickets. She downgraded us. We're stuck in some filthy economy room, and the cruise line won't do anything to fix it." My mother let out a sharp gasp, her concern immediately shifting from confusion to panic, her maternal instincts kicking in at full force as she scrambled for a way to fix the mess that had just been dumped into her lap. "Oh my God, sweetheart, that can't be right," she said quickly, her voice rising as if sheer volume alone would undo what had already been done. "She wouldn't do something like that, not to her own brother. Let me call her, let me." But before she could even finish her sentence, Daniel was already shouting, his patience completely gone, his rage spilling over. "Fix this," he snapped, his voice thick with frustration, his entitlement so blatant that even Olivia took a small step back, suddenly unsure of whether she should be comforting him or fearing him. "I'm not spending a week in some closet. Get her to fix it." But there was no fixing it. Because as the final boarding call rang through the dock, as the staff ushered them toward the entrance, as they were forced to step onto the ship knowing they were walking into a nightmare, there was absolutely nothing my mother could do. And at home, sipping my coffee, listening to her panicked voicemail begging me to please explain what had happened, I smiled. Because Daniel and Olivia had no idea just how much worse things were about to get. The ship had barely pulled away from the dock before reality started sinking its sharp, unforgiving claws into Daniel and Olivia, dragging them down from the heights of their entitled fantasies and plunging them into the depths of an experience they never imagined they would have to endure. From the moment they stepped aboard, the differences between what they had expected and what they had actually received became impossible to ignore, each tiny detail a slow, torturous realization that this trip would be nothing like the luxurious getaway they had so arrogantly assumed was theirs. The first thing they noticed was the way they were herded like cattle into the standard boarding process, forced to wait in long, winding lines alongside families with screaming children, elderly couples moving at a glacial pace, and groups of college students loudly talking over one another about how excited they were to get wasted every night. There was no priority check-in, no fast-tracked welcome service, no champagne waiting for them as they stepped onto the deck, just an overcrowded lobby where passengers shuffled forward impatiently, their luggage dragging noisily across the tile floors as cruise employees called out names and handed out room assignments. Daniel, still clinging to the last shreds of his false confidence, had tried to wave over one of the staff members, his voice thick with the kind of arrogance that had always worked in his favor. "Hey, can we just go straight to our room? We're supposed to be in first class, and I think there's been a mix-up." The woman, barely looking up from her clipboard, simply nodded toward the economy boarding line without even pausing to engage. All passengers in standard accommodations must complete check-in here before proceeding to their cabins. Next. Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides as Olivia let out a sharp, frustrated breath, already feeling the weight of this isn't how it was supposed to be pressing down on her. The grating sound of a baby crying somewhere nearby only made it worse, her lips pulling into a tight, disgusted line as she turned to her husband, her voice clipped with irritation. "This is ridiculous. Why are we even waiting here with these people? We were supposed to be priority guests." Daniel didn't answer because for the first time, a small, sinking part of him knew that no matter how much he yelled, no matter how entitled he acted, no matter who he complained to, this situation was not going to be fixed. And it only got worse from there. By the time they finally made it to their cabin, the full extent of what had been done to them became painfully clear. The moment Olivia stepped inside, she froze, her entire body going stiff as her wide, horrified eyes took in the sheer smallness of the space, her hands gripping the sides of her suitcase so tightly that her knuckles turned white. There was no private balcony. There was no floor-to-ceiling window with breathtaking ocean views. There was no plush king-sized bed with high-thread count sheets. Instead, there was a tiny, windowless box of a room, with barely enough space for the two of them to stand comfortably without bumping into the bed, the walls, or each other. The air felt stale, the low hum of the ship's engine vibrating through the floor, and in the far corner was the worst sight of all, a cramped, closet-sized bathroom with a shower so pitifully small that Olivia instinctively recoiled at the thought of stepping inside it. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief as she turned to Daniel, her face contorted in sheer outrage. "No. I'm not staying in this closet for a whole week. Fix it." Daniel, still standing at the doorway as if moving further into the room might confirm the nightmare, pulled out his phone with shaking hands, immediately dialing guest services, his breath heavy, his patience already shattered. When the line finally connected, he launched into his demand without so much as a greeting. "Yeah, we need a room change now. There's been a mistake with our booking, and we were supposed to have a suite, but someone screwed up, and we got put in this hole instead. I need you to." "I apologize for any inconvenience, sir," the woman on the other end of the line interrupted, her tone polite but unmistakably unmoved. "However, all cabins have been pre-assigned, and unfortunately, there are no available upgrades on this voyage. Additionally, as stated in the terms of your ticket purchase, all reservations in this category are non-refundable and non-adjustable once on board." Daniel's face twisted into something truly ugly, his jaw tightening so hard that his teeth ached. "You're joking," he spat, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. "You have to have something better than this. We can pay for the upgrade, whatever it costs, I don't care. Just move us to a better room." "I'm very sorry, sir," the woman replied, her voice smooth, practiced, completely unfazed by his tone. "As I said, there are no available upgrades at this time. If you need further assistance, please visit our guest services desk." And then, with an infuriatingly calm finality, she hung up. Daniel let out a low, furious growl, throwing his phone onto the bed with so much force that Olivia let out a startled gasp, stepping back as if he might actually explode. "I knew this was your sister," she hissed, her voice thick with rage, her carefully composed demeanor completely shattered as she ran both hands through her hair. "She did this to us. She ruined our trip. Daniel didn't respond, because the anger boiling inside him was threatening to consume him, because every single thing that had gone wrong was proving, without a doubt, that this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some clerical error, wasn't an accident, wasn't something that could be easily undone. This was intentional, this was calculated, this was personal. And as Olivia continued to pace, as she pulled out her phone in some desperate attempt to distract herself, as she opened the cruise app to see what little they could salvage from this experience, she let out a sharp, horrified gasp that made Daniel's stomach drop. "What?" he demanded, his patience already gone, his rage bubbling over the edges of his control. She turned to him slowly, her face frozen in shock, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly that her nails threatened to break against the screen. "There's no Wi-Fi in economy," she whispered, her voice filled with a kind of disbelief that was somehow worse than all the anger that had come before it. And for the first time in his entire life, Daniel knew exactly what it felt like to lose. By the time my phone had rung for the 10th time that morning, I knew without even looking that my mother had fully entered the meltdown phase, the part of the crisis where rational thought had completely abandoned her, replaced by a panicked desperation to fix the situation before Daniel completely unraveled. I let it ring, watching as her name flashed across the screen, my finger hovering over the decline button before simply flipping my phone over and letting the vibration fade into the background noise of my peaceful morning. I could only imagine what was happening on that ship, how Daniel's rage had surely turned into something loud and unbearable, how Olivia was likely pacing their tiny, windowless cabin in a state of pure distress, how every part of their entitled little fantasy had crumbled the moment they realized there was no escape. The first voicemail came through not even a minute later, her voice already on the edge of hysterical, her words rushed, frantic, dripping with the kind of exasperation she always reserved for when I was the problem, for when I had done something unforgivable. "I don't know what the hell you were thinking, young lady, but you need to fix this right now. Your brother and Olivia are humiliated. They've been put in the worst conditions imaginable, and I cannot believe you would be so petty as to pull something like this. Do you have any idea how this is making us look?" There it was. Us. It wasn't just about Daniel, wasn't just about his suffering. It was about how they looked, how this reflected on them, how my parents, after a lifetime of coddling and indulging him, had now been made fools by his absolute breakdown over something they had promised him would be perfect. The next voicemail came in before I had even finished listening to the first one, her voice now taking on that thin, sharp edge of forced patience, the kind she used when she was trying to manipulate, when she thought that if she framed it correctly, I would see reason. "Sweetheart," she sighed, dragging out the word as if I were a child who needed gentle correction. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this isn't who you are. You are better than this. I understand that maybe you were hurt when we thought Daniel needed the trip more, but surely you can see that this isn't the way to handle things. We're family, darling, and family doesn't do this kind of thing to each other." I let out a soft, bitter laugh, shaking my head as I stared at the ceiling, wondering how it was possible that after everything, after years of making it so clear that Daniel could do no wrong, after a lifetime of his comfort being placed above my own, she still thought she could guilt me into backing down. The fact that she truly believed that I was the one being unreasonable, that I was the one who had to fix this, that I had somehow done something unacceptable, was almost comical. And then, the third voicemail, the one where the forced patience had completely evaporated, the one where her real frustration had fully boiled over into something venomous, something cutting, something designed to make me feel what she thought I should be feeling. "This is cruel," she snapped, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts as if she had worked herself into a full-blown rage. "Daniel doesn't deserve this kind of humiliation. He doesn't deserve to be treated like some common peasant, crammed into a disgusting little room while other people, less deserving people, are enjoying the luxury that should have been his. I don't care what kind of petty grudge you're holding on to, I don't care what point you think you're making, but you need to call the cruise line and tell them to fix this. You need to make it right now, before it ruins everything." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the words settle, letting them hang in the air for a moment before reaching for my phone, unlocking it, and typing out a short, effortless response. "It's out of my hands. That was it. No long explanation, no fake apology, no justifications. Just 6 simple words that made it crystal clear that I had absolutely no intention of doing anything to help them. And oh, I knew that response would drive her insane. Meanwhile, on the ship, I had no doubt that Daniel and Olivia were running out of options, had no doubt that after realizing I wasn't going to cave, they had moved on to their next brilliant plan, begging the cruise line for an upgrade. I could already picture Daniel at the guest services desk, his voice loud, his face red, his hands gesturing wildly as he demanded that someone fix this, as he tried to convince them that this was all a horrible mistake. But the thing about cruise ships? Once you were on board, once the rooms had been assigned, once the guest lists had been finalized, there was no changing anything. The cruise line had zero incentive to accommodate them, zero interest in their sob story, zero patience for their entitled demands. And sure enough, within the hour, my mother was calling again, her name flashing across my screen, the desperation in her messages growing more frantic as the reality of the situation finally settled in. "They won't do anything," her text read, the words practically screaming from the screen. "The cruise line says there are no available upgrades. They said all the suites are full. Do you understand what this means?" "Yes, Mother, I understand exactly what it means. It means Daniel and Olivia are stuck for 7 full days in that tiny, claustrophobic, unbearable little cabin, with no escape, no luxury, no VIP treatment, and no one left to blame except themselves." And just when I thought the day couldn't get any better, my phone dinged again, this time with an email notification. Daniel, reaching out in one final, furious attempt to put me in my place. "You think this is funny? You think you won? You have no idea what you've started. Fix this now, or you'll regret it." I stared at the email for a long moment, the corner of my mouth twitching upward, my pulse steady, my satisfaction absolute. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I deleted it. Because for the first time in his life, Daniel was the one with no control. The cruise had come to an end. The grand vacation that Daniel and Olivia had been so smugly looking forward to had finally reached its miserable conclusion, and for the first time in his entire life, my brother had been forced to endure something he could neither escape nor manipulate to his advantage. 7 days trapped in a cramped, windowless cabin, 7 days of bland buffet food and noisy dining halls, 7 days of standing in long lines instead of breezing through VIP entrances, 7 days of being just another ordinary passenger with no special treatment, no luxury, no way to make himself feel superior to everyone else. And now, they were back, exhausted, seething, their frustration bubbling under the surface like a pot threatening to boil over, ready to explode the moment they had the chance to confront the person they blamed for it all. And that person, of course, was me. I knew the second their plane landed because my phone started buzzing almost immediately, my mother's name flashing across the screen. The relentless persistence of her calls a clear indication that she had no intention of letting this go. I ignored the first 3, letting them roll to voicemail, knowing full well that each one would be increasingly desperate, knowing that she would be barely holding back the urge to scream at me through the phone. By the 4th call, my curiosity got the better of me, and I finally answered, pressing the speaker button and leaning back in my chair, my fingers tapping idly against the table as I waited for her to speak. The moment she heard my voice, she exploded. All the fake patience, all the forced politeness, all the attempts at reasoning completely gone, replaced by raw, furious disbelief. "I cannot believe you," she shrieked, her voice cracking slightly from the sheer force of her anger. "I cannot believe you would do something so spiteful, so cruel, so disrespectful to your own brother. Do you have any idea how humiliated he was? Do you even care what you put him through?" I let out a slow breath, tilting my head slightly as I considered how to respond, knowing that nothing I said would actually change her mind, knowing that this wasn't about understanding but about control, about demanding that I feel guilty, about forcing me to apologize for something that had been completely, entirely deserved. "I got you a luxury cruise," I said simply, my tone light, conversational, completely unbothered by her fury. You gave it away. What happened after that wasn't my concern. There was a beat of stunned silence, a brief, shocked pause where I could feel the weight of my words settling over her, where I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as she tried to process the fact that I wasn't groveling, wasn't apologizing, wasn't doing what she had expected me to do. And then, just as suddenly, the rage returned, hotter, sharper, filled with something almost desperate. You manipulated the tickets, she snapped, her voice rising with every word, as if yelling at me louder would somehow undo what had already happened. You intentionally made sure Daniel and Olivia would suffer. You intentionally embarrassed them. You intentionally ruined their trip. That is not what family does. You had no right to do that. I smiled to myself, shaking my head slightly at the sheer irony of her words, at the way she had effortlessly twisted the narrative in her mind to make me the villain, to make Daniel the victim, to make it seem as though I had somehow taken something from him instead of giving him exactly what he had deserved. Interesting, I mused, my voice dripping with amusement, because I don't remember Daniel calling me when he took the tickets. I don't remember you consulting me before you handed over a gift that wasn't yours to give. I don't remember anyone thinking about my feelings when you decided he deserved my generosity more than you did. But now, suddenly, I'm the bad guy for making sure he got exactly what was coming to him. Another silence, this one heavier, filled with something bitter, something resentful, something that told me she knew I was right but would never admit it, would never let herself acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, Daniel had finally received the barest fraction of the consequences he had spent his entire life avoiding. And then, the final nail in the coffin, the thing that made her anger boil over completely. I don't regret it, I said simply, my voice firm, steady, completely unwavering. Not even for a second. She gasped, the sound filled with sheer disbelief, as if she had truly expected me to break, to crack, to give in under the weight of her disappointment. I raised you better than this, she snapped, her voice sharp, her frustration now turning into something almost pleading, as if she needed me to see myself as the villain, needed me to feel like I had gone too far. I raised you to have compassion, to be better than this kind of pettiness. You need to apologize, to Daniel, to Olivia, to all of us, because what you did was cruel. I let out a soft, amused laugh, shaking my head as I leaned back in my chair, stretching my legs out in front of me, feeling more at peace than I had in years. That's not going to happen, I said simply, the finality in my voice making it clear that this conversation was over. And with that, I hung up. Later that evening, I checked my emails, scrolling past a dozen unread messages before spotting one from Daniel, the subject line filled with nothing but pure, unfiltered rage. You have no idea what you've done. I smiled, took a slow sip of my wine, and closed my laptop. Because for the first time in his life, my brother finally understood what it felt like to lose. Was I wrong for what I did? Or did my brother finally get exactly what was coming to him? Let me know in the comments.